spikes and becomes hugely absorbed by oxygen. Now in this article, 60 gigahertz, they openly admit that 60 gigahertz is absorbable by oxygen. You can see in this graph here its impact on oxygen. All the frequencies before 60 gig are non-impacted. Then once it hits that frequency, it spikes and becomes hugely absorbed by oxygen. Now in this article by the companies selling products that are going to run on 60 gig, they say that it's going to help its interference levels. Oh, isn't that nice? They don't want your first shooter video games to lag. And most of us know from mainstream releases promoting FIVEG that things like water and trees are going to get in the way of this frequency. So how in the world does this even make sense that we are using it? Unless their intentions are something else besides faster speeds. Anyway, knowing that this frequency impacts oxygen, now does it make sense to you how possibly when you mess with the absorption of oxygen in the human body, let me give you one guess which organ is going to suffer first. The way that the 60 gigahertz impacts oxygen is this. Oxygen, the atom, is O. Oxygen, the molecule, is O2. Two atoms together. Now these two atoms creating the oxygen molecule are sharing some electrons. 60 gigahertz causes the electrons surrounding oxygen molecules to spin. Right. Somewhat akin to how high-powered microwaves running on 2.4 are impacting molecules in foods such as water. They're heating in part by impacting those molecules to rotate or oscillate with each wave. The movement energy from the rotation of these super tiny water molecules is actually helping to heat the rest of the food. So in a similar way that 2.4 causes H2O to oscillate, 60 gigahertz, even at lower powers, is causing the electrons on oxygen molecules to spin. And as you might imagine, changes to the spin frequencies on oxygen electrons can have impacts on human biology. When you breathe in, the reason that breathing air into your lungs gets oxygen into your blood and therefore in important places like your brain is because the oxygen entering into your lungs gets picked up by a very important iron-containing protein called hemoglobin in your blood. But the unfortunate impact of oxygen molecules spinning the electrons is that it makes the hemoglobin unable to uptake the oxygen and get it to the rest of your body. Now, this info is taken from a textbook called Magnetobiology, Underlying Physical Problems. But
So
some of the effects that we can look at, well, one thing is just our regular Wi-Fi, 2.4 gigahertz. That's in the same range as microwave ovens, which are also called radar ranges, because that is radar. 2.4 gigahertz is interesting. It's not the peak absorption rate in water for microwave frequencies, but it's at a point where it allows full penetration, because if it came in at the peak, it would prevent the insides from getting warm. So that's with basic Wi-Fi. Now when we look at 5G, 60 gigahertz, this is what they call active dispersal sort of weaponry, just to keep people back. It burns the skin, it doesn't penetrate, but 60 gigahertz is the frequency of oxygen molecule absorption.
oxygen molecule absorption.
Since they have electrons that they share with each other, what we breathe is actually O2, pair of oxygen. So being bombarded with 60 gigahertz could very well impair our oxygen absorption rate in our body, and thereby the whole basis of our living system.
protein called hemoglobin in your blood. But the unfortunate impact of oxygen molecules spinning the electrons is that it makes the hemoglobin unable to uptake the oxygen and get it to the rest of your body. Now, this info is taken from a textbook called Magnetobiology, Underlying Physical Problems. But even beyond this, isn't the fact that the telecom companies are admitting that 60 gigahertz is absorbable by oxygen just stunning information? And shouldn't the fact that 60 gigahertz even fundamentally interacts with oxygen, the most abundant and arguably most important element to all of biological life, be headline news? That's to continue working, right? Now, if you're not getting that into your muscles because it isn't coming into your hemoglobin, there's no feeding your muscles, including your heart, thus, right, acute cardiac injury, which is also listed in this. Now, while it's true, pneumonia also causes respiratory distress and an inability to get proper oxygen. That's true. However, don't we all know by now that pneumonia causes your lungs to do one basic thing? Fill with fluid, fill with phlegm. Yummy. Almost every 101 tutorial on pneumonia says the same thing. The main problems with pneumonia are the lack of oxygen as a result of phlegm. And how you can even tell what phase of pneumonia you're in according to the color of your phlegm. Well, check this out. Now, much of what I'm finding regarding this CV is pointing to people who don't actually have fluid in their lungs at all, but they have dry coughs. Not wet coughs like this.
No phlegm. No phlegm at all.
But dry coughs with no phlegm. So in the same report, this doctor found the same thing, dry cough. But also these social leaks of media, people who are using social media, they're so desperate. They're desperate to get help. Here they're saying the same thing. Look at this. Inability to breathe and dry cough. So please, would one of you virologists care to explain to me why these people have respiratory distress, aka can't breathe, if there's no phlegm causing the problems with oxygen uptake? I mean, besides the 60 gigahertz frequency making hemoglobin unable to properly bind to oxygen.
5G.
Now, a lot of people had scans.
5G.
Scans are showing that people have damage to the lungs.
Smart
But how do we
meters.
know that this isn't due to other repercussions of millimeter waves on oxygen itself? I mean, when your voice, this is slightly off topic, but not really. When your voice matches a frequency of a crystal glass, it becomes absorbed by it and it shatters, right?
People while they stood 1 foot in front of the smart meter, and in every single case, the human energy field was obliterated as they stood in front of the smart meter. So in our first slides, what we see, red blood cells are stacking up, which makes it very difficult for the blood to deliver oxygen to the tissues as they would be their normal function. Every single one of these is a degradation. Every single one of these shows a trauma to the blood cells, and that came from something, and the only variable was the smart meter. The good news in all this is the patient.
So the smart meter and 5G are kicking out 60 gigahertz, which doesn't allow the oxygen to get to the tissues.
The good news in all this is that every single one of these shows a trauma to the blood cells, and that came from something, and the only variable was the smart meter. See a phenomenon called rouleau, where the red blood cells are stacking up, which makes it very difficult for the blood to deliver oxygen to the tissues as they would be their normal function. Every single one of these is a degradation. Every single one of these shows a trauma to the blood cells.
I'm just saying,
And-
why am I having to ask these questions? Also, it's mentioned, acute kidney injury. We know kidneys can be damaged when there's so little oxygen in the blood that the other gases become higher, like carbon dioxide in the other ones. Acidosis of the blood happens. Again, guys, I am not a doctor. Do not listen to anything I say. This is for entertainment purposes only. However, I'm just trying to use common sense here and ask some
Common
questions that no one
sense.
else seems to be asking. So, CV seems to cause many problems, okay? They can all be tied to a lack of oxygen and acidosis of the blood. Now, we know that the impacts of magnetic frequencies can have a result of things like seizures, right? How often do people with pneumonia have seizures? But we have seen tons of leak footage of people with exactly that, seizures. I've also heard fungal infections mentioned in relation to this, and electromagnetic fields can absolutely exacerbate fungus and mold. Now, of course, people talk about fevers, and the